Thanks, Enrico. I have quite a quiet voice, so I have to project. So can you hear me at the back? People at the back. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to focus on the research aspect of this. So I'm not going to talk at all about mediation. There was some coverage of mediation in the article, but we're going to focus purely on the research aspects, which is more the section 5 of the report. We'll skip the conceptual stuff, although we'll talk about the conceptual stage. So I'm going to start off with some information. I mean, this is a link which I've just put there so that you can find the actual companion module later when you've got this PowerPoint. I'm going to start off by just reminding you what the CFR is. In fact, for the first 4 points there, this is just information. So I'm going to race through it quite quickly, but it'll be there in the PowerPoint for you to have another look at later. And then at point 5, we get really into the research stuff, which is more related to the articles that you read. So to remind you on the CFR has been around now for nearly 20 years, well, more than 20 years online. Graves wrote that it's one of the most important curriculum publications of the last decades. Jack Richards, of infamy from Richards and Rogers, wrote that it's perhaps the most widespread example of backward design. Backward design is working back from end objectives to what you're going to teach. And Charles Alderson and other colleagues wrote that it's probably the best research scales of foreign language proficiency in the world. And we're going to talk about why. What's different about the way in which the CFR descriptors were developed 20 years ago and the way that we did the update in the last 5 years. So what it's all about is that there's a concept of constructive alignment, which is aligning planning, teaching, and assessment all into an integrated whole. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but traditionally those 3 things have been seen more or less separately. The connections between a curriculum and what teachers actually do in class has traditionally been pretty tenuous. And the connections between what happens in class and what in assessment happens, there's often been absolutely no relationship between the two, unless people start teaching to the test and just teaching exam questions. And then backwards design is linked to the idea of competency-based teaching, where you define the end objectives in terms usually of can-do statements, can do this, can demonstrate that, etc. And then you work backwards from those statements to design the course. The aim being to produce a transparent, coherent curriculum in which planning, teaching, and assessment are all integrated. So planning, the goal setting with students, you use descriptors, can-do descriptors to signpost, to tell everybody what's happening, tell the students, tell the other teachers, etc. It's a way of ensuring that different languages in the same department or in different parallel departments are using the same scheme, that you all use the same can-do objectives because they're valid across languages. And then the actual teaching with an action-oriented approach, working towards real-life language ability in tasks with conditions and constraints that reflect reality, language as an activity, learning through doing, etc., and assessment. And with assessment, the descriptors are useful for designing tasks, with descriptors from CFR Chapter 4, which are about what students can do and the domains and the conditions and restraints. And then to help design assessment criteria for the quality of what they've done, Chapter 5 of the CFR is about aspects of competence, so qualitative aspects, like aspects of linguistic competence or pragmatic competence, sociolinguistic, etc. The companion volume, which has just been published online just over a year ago. The definitive version, which went up in February last year, has a text which explains key aspects of the CFR. It's very worth reading. It's only 20 pages long. Got lots of pictures, some color, not difficult to read, and you would find it very useful in future situations where you're trying to explain to other people what is the CFR. You could cut out that 20 pages and just use that as an orientation tool. And then there's a complete set of the descriptors, the old ones and the new ones, and they each come with a little rationale telling you what this scale is about and what are the things that are, what are the different constructs or sub-constructs in the scale. And then there are a whole bunch of appendices with supposedly useful material. In terms of changes to the 2001 descriptors, we made very few changes, no changes except where necessary. The top and the bottom have been enriched a lot, and also what are called the plus levels, because you have a sort of B1 and B1 plus, B2, B1 plus. The pluses have been elaborated a little bit, all on the basis of work done in other projects that have used a similar methodology to the methodology which we're going to discuss. Because this methodology I developed, actually dreamt up on a visiting fellowship at Mellon Fellowship at the National Foreign Language Center in Washington in '92, before we did the research behind the CFR project. And a lot of other projects have now used this methodology to develop descriptors. And so we were able to use some of those descriptors to fill gaps in the original scale. The phonology scale was completely replaced thanks to Enrique Picardo, who did it more or less single-handed, a parallel research project, because she was dissatisfied with the original one. And we also got rid of references to the native speakers. There were only 13 references, and they were not about comparing to the ability of a native speaker. They were talking about the way that a native speaker behaves with you. So do they change their behavior or not? But in any case, we found a different way of expressing it. So what we're going to be talking about is the new scales for mediation and plurilingual and pluricultural competence, or to be more precise, the way that these were developed. And that involves completing the CFR descriptive scheme. This is an overlay, an overview of the CFR descriptive scheme. And what is innovative about it is the idea of interaction and mediation. Previous to the CFR, and I'm sorry to say still very prevalent up to the present, is a fixation with the 4 skills, which is a completely abstract and arbitrary division, because language is almost never used in isolation of one of those 4 skills. If you put those together, they are reception and production. Before the existence of the CFR, basically the learner was seen as a speaker-hearer, and the focus in language teaching was on teaching a code. And if you were really progressive, you thought about fluency as well as accuracy. And the aim was that students would learn to mobilize their linguistic resources in the context in which they found themselves. The CFR in 2001 moved things forward towards a new vision with the introduction of the concept of integrated skills, the fact that interaction is more than just the sum of reception and production. It's a joint co-construction of discourse, where you're negotiating meaning, getting onto the same wavelength, understanding and getting through to each other. And also mediation and the concept of the learner as a social agent, introducing the concept of agency into language learning. We're talking here about 1996. This is actually considerably before other people were talking about agency in connection with language learning. And then you get to the final, the completion of the scheme with the companion volume, where we have fleshed out this concept of mediation, the learner being involved in mediating activities as a social agent, and in being involved in the co-construction of new meaning. The difference between, I'm using the word there to mean co-construction of new meaning, co-construction of new concepts, helping other people to understand a concept. That's not the same thing as getting on the same wavelength, negotiation of meaning, which is what interaction is about. And mediation is about the construction of new meaning, new concepts, new understanding, either for yourself or for other people, as a teacher, as a knowledgeable other, as a facilitator, as a mediator. And instead of just talking about mobilizing your linguistic competencies, you're talking about mobilizing your plurilingual and pluricultural competencies, your entire repertoire. So it was about descriptors, and a little detour on descriptors, but it is actually an important point to make. This is what descriptors look like. Those of you who have worked with the CFR will recognize them. They usually start with can. And they're usually fairly complicated sentences. For example, if we take the second one, can, with some effort, catch much of what is said around him or her in discussion, but may find it difficult to participate effectively in discussion with several speakers of the target language who do not modify their speech in any way. That is a situation we all recognize if you speak a foreign language, when you can handle everything fine, provided people make some allowance for the fact that that it's not your first language. Descriptors are increasingly popular. When the CFR was developed in the mid-90s, the concept of competence-based teaching, which is now being applied right across the curriculum, was in its infancy. And standards or frameworks of standards of competences defined with descriptors are more and more common, but it remains very, very rare, very, very unusual for them to bother with any form of validation. Usually what happens is a bunch of intelligent people sit around in a room, meet twice a month for 3 months, brainstorm, make lists of stuff, make drafts, circulate it to other people they know by email, have a little conference, have a workshop and say, right, that's done, finished, version 1. And then 5 years later, because of people who have been criticizing it, they say, okay, and they bang out version 2. And then a few years later, the same process. So that over a period of time, the thing is improved through experiential learning, if you like. But it's usually the case that there isn't a formal validation project up front. And that also means that they're often unrealistic. David Stern, one of the guru who started the language department here, said in '89 that standards for criterion referencing should be developed in relation to realistic norms of achievement for the groups in question. And one of the problems is that standards are very often plucked out of the air by a bunch of people without thinking about developing them in a data-based manner in relation to real students by looking at the behavior of real students. Glaser, the founder of the concept of criterion referencing, talked about a continuum of knowledge ranging from no proficiency at all to perfect performance. And the idea was that along this continuum of attainment, a criterion reference measures says what the individual can do and can't, by implication cannot do, in relation to this underlying continuum of achievement. And a CR measure is a measure which measures what the student can do in terms of this criterion standard. And the original meaning of criterion standard is the continuum of ability. And where you put them on this continuum of ability is completely independent of no reference to the performance of others. This was revolutionary in 1963. Because up until that time and up until really the 1980s, in most educational systems, people were just sorted by a bell curve into different groups for different lives. The idea was, some people had to fail. That was the mentality. Some people get A's, some people fail, and that's it. And every year, you just move this bell curve from one set of results to the next set of results to maintain a constant standard that 20% of the people get a D or whatever. That's the way it was done. In other words, everybody was always being measured in relation to the other people in their cohort. There was no concept of what are we trying to teach these people? How good are they actually getting? Where are they in geography or mathematics or French in relation to actually using it in real life? So this is what was revolutionary. At exactly the same time, 1963, an applied psychologist and a nurse working together worked out the very first empirically developed assessment scale, putting descriptors onto a mathematical scale. for assessing nursing competence. And what they did was two things. First of all, a bunch of people assigned their descriptors into categories for different scales. And then they thought about where they would put these descriptors on the continuum and place them on the continuum. And they computed the means and standard deviations and stuff to decide where to put things on the scale. So the idea of developing a scale of descriptors empirically with data goes way back to 1963, but has been completely ignored in applied linguistics for the following 30 years. During that time, something called the Rasch model came along. Has anybody ever heard of the Rasch model? Right, well, the Rasch model was invented by a guy called George Rasch, who was a Danish mathematician, but it remained a theoretical thing until computers got powerful enough to actually be able to do an analysis for it, which was round about 1980. And the idea of the Rasch model is that in the process of analyzing a test, you can remove, or anything, you can remove the people who can't do it, the noisy items, the outliers. You can get rid of the raters who are no good, or the items that are no good, and make the scale longer and more accurate. You can calibrate descriptors to a mathematical scale, which is more or less linear. And the great advantage is that whereas classical test theory is any result you have is limited to the group from which you got those results, with the Rasch model, or latent trait theory, you can generalize to other groups, provided they can be considered members of the same population. So if you do an experiment and you could develop something in relation to a group of students of French, then you can generalize this to other groups of students of French, provided they form part of the same cohort in some way. So for example, inside Canada or inside English-speaking countries, it will be reasonable to generalize. And you can, then there are ways of testing whether that's true. And then finally, you can expand the scale. You can expand your scale of, in our case, descriptors, like you would expand an item bank for a testing model. This is what the output from a Rasch model looks like. And this is from the original CFR research. These are the students here. Those are the teachers, and there's a massive difference in severity in the teachers. They're also being measured. And over here, you can see that a truncated version of the items. So if we look at Sibylla, Sibylla can describe things. She can give clear, detailed descriptions. She can communicate spontaneously, and she has a pretty clear natural pronunciation. And she only occasionally makes slips and mistakes and stuff. Whereas Doris can't do any of that yet. Doris is just below that, but whoops. But Doris is fine with, she can adjust to changes in conversation, she has no problem, etc., etc. A more recent one from a project that Enrica and I have just done comparing the CFR and Canadian language benchmarks with trained raters 20 years later when people are used to using a scale of proficiency. Over here you can see now all the raters are very close together. Whoops. Oh. Yeah, and you can even relate the way that the two rating scales that people use, how they relate to each other. So it's a very nice little tool, the Rasch model. And you can also expand the scale by using some of the old items as what you call anchor items, and have a load of new items, and then you can put the things together. And there's a technique to discover which of the things you use as anchor items don't work, and then you get rid of them. And for some strange reason, some of them, there's always one or two that don't work. So, as I said before the advent of the CFR, all existing descriptor scales and standards for all subjects were just written by individuals and committees. There was no use of measurement theory, there was little awareness of different formats, and there was little awareness of the need for concrete can-do formulations. There was one single pioneer, whose name is Dori Kenyon, and who is nowadays head of the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, and is kind of the pope nowadays for the actful scale. He did an actful post-validity study, which he explained to me, which gave me the idea of how to develop the methodology for the CFR. And after all of that experience, I developed a set of guidelines, which is actually put in the back of the CFR, for what descriptors should be like. We'll just look at definiteness, which is perhaps the crucial one. Things should be definite, describe something concrete. And this was pointed out as long ago as 1941, where a scale must be more than mere words. It should be trying to describe something with concrete vividness as much as you can. And the use of words like or rarely or usually or slightly or extremely or occasionally, sometimes, often, never, it's only excusable if the scale value does not depend. Strangely enough, most rating scales in applied linguistics, including TOEFL, test of spoken English, all of these things, they still divide the different grades, and also the Ontario curriculum. They still divide the grades with a little qualifier like this. And this has been, as I said, it's been criticized now for 60, 70 years as not being valid for assessment. Right, that's the background. So how do you avoid that? You avoid that by developing descriptors. Instead of starting out saying, I want to do a scale for pronunciation, and then we'll have 5 levels, and then you start trying to spread pronunciation across these 5 levels like butter. What you do is you start off by saying, right, let's get some descriptors first, some sensible descriptors, and then afterwards we'll find out what level they are. So the way we did this in this project was there were 6 phases, as you can see there, and it went from January 14 to October 2017. So basically, for 14, 15, 16, basically 4 years. And we had a kind of I discovered later that it's a classic community of practice structure. An authoring group, around that a sounding board of people to react interactively by email and occasional meetings. So they would come to your meetings, but they don't actually do much work. But they're there to give you feedback all the time. And then around that, you have a group of more formal consultants whom you maybe see twice a year or once a year and present drafts to. And the point I made earlier was that most projects jump straight from that sort of development to saying, right, we've got it, now we will consult. Leaving out the validation and analysis in the middle. Whereas the methodology, which I mentioned before, there's 3 steps. One is intuitive or conceptual, where you collect what's around. Everybody always works from very sensibly. You need to find out what exists. There's this saying, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Only if you bother to find out who the giants were. You know? If you start from scratch each time, you're not likely to produce anything new. You need to discover what's already out there and collect it, and then work from that to produce something better. And then there's qualitative validation, and then finally quantitative. And the idea with the qualitative is to first of all to get a bunch of teachers, and in this project back then we had 32 workshops, get a bunch of teachers to evaluate your draft descriptors, because teachers are very good at criticizing things. You know, they're very good at criticizing, saying what they don't like about things, and you can even get them to suggest improvements. You know, so you can get them to actually rewrite the descriptors. And then the second thing is, if people have difficulty matching a descriptor to the category it's supposed to describe, there is a problem. Either there's something wrong with the categories, or there's something wrong with the descriptors, or both. So one thing you do is give people some similar categories, like conversation, discussion, information exchange. They're all kind of similar. In a conversation, you exchange information. A conversation often develops into a discussion. But they are fundamentally 3 different things. You know, conversation is social, discussion is kind of argumentative, ideational, and information exchange is transactional. So in Hallidayan terms, they are 3 completely different things, but they shade into each other. So can you produce descriptors that people can put into these 3 piles with some accuracy? And then finally, when you know what you've got is good, then you calibrate it. But the point is, you have to have something good before the calibration. There's an expression of which the polite version is garbage in, garbage out, with any statistical analysis. So you've got to know that what you've got is good. The real work is before the quantitative analysis, because you have to know you've got something good. There's Cyril Weir, those of you in the language testing course, I mentioned someone I heard outside saying they were in the assessment course. You will discover there's a guy called Cyril Weir who talks about a priori validity as well as a posteriori validity. Traditionally, people have thought about validity as something to do afterwards to prove your test works. The most important thing is to get it right in the first place through qualitative validation. Right, so development, I mean, the place to start is not with the CFR or existing thing, but rather discover what kind of language behavior is out there and what would be useful in your context. So there's a whole process by which we went through, collecting stuff and defining the main concepts we wanted, formulating this into descriptors, and then consulting small scale to improve the formulations, and consulting small scale to see if people have some idea of what the level is, and then reanalyzing everything. And you just keep going around in circles, repeating this in iterative stages, amending and dropping and adding descriptors as you go through each cycle. And the cycle is basically, you change things and then you go through this small scale consultation, which can just be with 2 or 3 people. You don't need that many people. It just has to be somebody who didn't write it. Because you can go around, you can convince yourself if you're working on this kind of stuff, you find it very hard to separate yourself from the stuff you're working on. You need to have input from other people who have never seen it before. So anyway, by the end of, after a year, we had descriptors which are much shorter, much better focused, and 35% of them had got eliminated, and half the rest were substantially revised. The validation, the qualitative validation, first of all, you need informants. So we built up a network of informants from various associations connected with the CFR, and in the end, we had people at this stage from 45 countries. And they were divided into 5 divisions, and everything was spread nice and evenly across all 5 divisions. With a horrible looking system like that. Down the left-hand side, you have all the different scales, and across the top, you have the different questionnaire forms that people were going to get. And you just made sure that each questionnaire was distributed across a representative sample of respondents. And it all needs to fit together. If you're going to use a Rasch analysis, everything has to form one data set in the end. So you have to have several people. So here, there are three different questionnaires that had the descriptors for collaborating to construct meaning. So that is linking that together. So all of those different categories were looked at by 3 or 4 different groups of people, and it's done in such a way that the whole thing forms one data set. We had 990 informants working in pairs, and that was 445 pairs in 140 institutes. And as I said, they assigned to categories, they evaluated the descriptors for clarity, pedagogic usefulness, and relevance to the real world, and suggested formulations. So the form which they had looked like this, which you may recognize. Here, this was 5 mediation strategies that they were asked. And they had, for each descriptor, they had to say which category it belonged to, which is the tick. And then step 2 over on the right is the evaluation. Is it clearly formulated? Is it pedagogically useful? And is it relevant to real life? I was stupid enough to do all of this on paper because I thought I'd only have about 30 or 40 institutes. But the project got so popular that I had 140, and I had a stack of data that high, which I have to enter manually. So from then on, we used a survey. This is what the data kind of looked like, and anything which got less than 70%, yeah, was dropped. And so that cut out any descriptors which were you felt to be slightly less useful for one reason or another. And if people didn't, in this case, you can see that everybody put this in the right place, pretty much. So from that point of view, there was no problem with this descriptor. It was put in the right category. But it wasn't felt to be very clear, and it wasn't felt to be very pedagogically useful. It was only just 72, only just over the criterion for being relevant to the real world, so we dropped it. That just shows you, for each descriptor, there's a whole bunch of information, suggestions as to how it could be improved, with the red is just crossing out. So going through that process, we ended up with much shorter, much clearer descriptors, and we'd thrown away about 25%. And we wrote a few more. And then we moved to the next round, which was into the quantitative. Now we knew we had something good, we were into the quantitative. By this stage, we're up to 189 institutes and 1,294 participants. And the issue here was quite simple: assign the descriptors to a level. At what level do you think somebody could answer what level do you think that someone's language conforms to what's described in the descriptor? And there were two forms of analysis. One is classical analysis and the other Rasch analysis. The classical analysis, we just took the means and medians and then looked at descriptors if the dark green represents the area of a broader CFR level, like A2, B1, B2. And if 50% of the people, like in that second one, you've got 65% saying that sorry, I'm getting confused. No, that's not what this shows. This shows, I think it's one standard deviation. But anyway, if we look at the third one, 64% of people said that was either B2 or B2+. If you look at this third one here, shouldn't have pressed it, sorry.
Yeah, because we don't have.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot my point because I forgot I was doing this. So that's good if you get 64% of people all saying the same level. And the other thing was the Rasch analysis, and we wanted to anchor back to the original CFR, the values from the original CFR scale. This bit is complicated because how would you do that? How would you anchor back to the original scale? Well, there are a whole bunch of ways that you could do it. So I tried 4 of them. First of all, you can anchor to the steps on the scale, because we had the CFR has these 6 different levels, so there are 5 steps between them. So you could anchor your steps on your rating scale to that. That didn't work very well. I still don't really understand why, but it didn't. Then you could. The classic way to do it is that you include some existing descriptors which have already been calibrated, and they provide the anchor. That's the simplest and usual way to do it. Then the third way is do both of those things. And the final way is leave it alone, but have the anchors. And afterwards, there is a technique just in Excel to convert the scale you've got into the original scale, using means and standard deviations, things like that. It's just a technique. And so we collected the information for each descriptor for the 4 methods. That's anchoring the scale, that's anchoring the items, that's anchoring both the items and the scale, and this is the one that's done where you allow it all to move freely, and then later, through this technique with standard deviations and means and stuff, you link the 2 together. Where the first one produced different results. So there's something wrong with it, it didn't work. Where the other 3 produced the same answer, like with the first one, B1, all 3 of them say B1, fine, B1, we're happy. The same with the next one is a problem for some, because now why is the next one a problem? Oh yeah, Sorry, I can't remember why the next one is a problem. That looks all right, actually. But the one up, so you can see that the one at the next couple, three of the methods are saying B2, okay. 3 of the methods are saying B2 plus, okay. But the one after that, there is a disagreement between B1 plus and B2, and B1 is mentioned. Clearly, that should go into recalibration, another round. That's not good enough. So maybe we have to change the descriptor a little bit, or maybe we use another method, but it's not clear at the moment. So the idea was to discover which of these items, which of these descriptors are clearly, by a number of different anchoring methods, you get the same result. And then we had a very simple criterion. If it got 50% of people saying it's this level, you know, B1 or B1 plus, B2 or B1 plus, B2 or B2 plus, if we had 50% of people saying that, and we had the last 3 methods all saying it's this level, we said calibrate it. Anything else, it went into another round.
Why it was a problem, because the aim was A2C in the second.
Oh yeah.
And you never had A2.
That's right. The original aim was A2, and it was coming out as B1 plus. So there's something wrong here. So that's right. Thank you very much. Yes, of course, it was supposed to also relate to the original intention. Then the last phase was another quantitative phase, because there is a certain problem with asking people, what level do you think this is, in relation to a scale of levels? Because there's a certain circularity here, because people are familiar with the scale, and so they may notice that the concept of smoothly flowing text is something which they remember as occurring in CFR C1, C2. So they see, aha, smoothly flowing text must be C1. There's an element of circularity. Jim Lantoff and somebody, Frawley, pointed out this type of danger of this type of circular logic in relation to the actal scale back in I think it was 1985. So for your definitive calibration, you need to break out of this potential circularity of thinking. And therefore, in the original research, of course, this wasn't a problem because the CFR didn't exist yet. So we used, for the definitive calibration, it was back to the original task, which was, could you, or the person concerned that you're thinking of, which could be your partner or your kids, could they do what is described in the descriptor? Yes or no? So each descriptor is being used as a criterion statement, and the person is just answering yes or no. There's nothing about levels. And in fact, rather than yes or no, it's a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 0 is clearly no chance, beyond my capacities. 1 is, yeah, under favorable circumstances, with that being defined. You know, they say it 3 times, I can read it 4 times, the person is nice, they help me. Under normal circumstances, even in difficult circumstances, it's stressful, I can only hear it once, it's a noisy tape, etc. And then 4 is, don't insult me, much better than this. So this is using the descriptor for assessment. In the original research, it was teachers assessing a sample of students from their classes with questionnaires. In this version, because we were doing it all online, we asked people to do it for themselves in relation to different languages, or for other people they knew very well, and to do it for 3 people. There was an analysis with anchors back to the CFR and also to the descriptors that have been calibrated in phase 2. But there is a fundamental problem with it, expanding a bank of descriptors away from the original construct, that the anchoring is no longer valid, or you're moving away from what you had originally. In fact, in the original research, reading was not on the same scale as speaking and listening, or interaction and production, to put it a different way. Interaction and production were on one scale, and listening, one-way listening, which is receptive, was okay and fitted there fine, but reading did not. Reading was different and had to be equated separately. So even reading was away from the original construct. So we ran separate analyses for all of the constructs which were a bit different, like things to do with interpretation analysis, things to do with online interaction, things to do with reaction to literature, and things to do with plurilingual pluricultural. Because the fundamental principle in Rasch modeling that if you run a separate analysis for a category, and it produces different results on the mathematical scale, then you should believe the separate analysis and not the main analysis, because it means that you do not have unidimensionality. I mean, unidimensionality is a complicated concept. It's only it's in a psychometric terms. It just means that stuff can be considered to be part of the same data set, and you can validly have one test for this, or you can validly have one scale for this. Things which are in real life multidimensional often will often provide data that is, from a psychometric point of view, unidimensional. And there's always a test for that. And in Rasch modeling, the test is check it out by analyzing each category separately. And if the values change, it means that it's, from a measurement point of view, a separate dimension. Then we had a follow-up with an extra validation for the plurilingual pluricultural, because it had been right at the end of the questionnaire. We didn't have so many people doing it, because not everybody got to item 63. That was done with 2 independent groups, a group of project veterans who had volunteered. There were about 250 of them, and a bunch of plurilingual experts in plurilingual and pluriculturalism who we recruited by email. And then there was a separate one on phonology, as I mentioned, which Enrica organized, which went through all the 3 validation phases. But we had some anchor items, but we also, because of the fact we were replacing the old scale, we did not want to anchor to the old scale, because that would have been self-defeating. So we took some items from Cambridge and used them as kind of fake anchor items. But at the same time, we did an independent standard setting with a different method, which is the bookmark method, which, if you ever get involved in standard setting, is the simplest and best method of standard setting, which we could talk about later, but it's very simple. Then there was a third project on sign language, which again was completely separate, smaller scale because the signing community is very small, a simplified task because they're not familiar with the CFR, and an independent, again, the bookmark method. Just to show you what happened with the 2 independent groups on the plurilingual pluricultural, which you might think would be the most complicated part of the whole thing, it came out like that. Wow. The 2 groups agreed almost entirely. Correlation of 0.98 between the 2 of them. Although some were doing it in English, some were doing it in French, some are so self-proclaimed experts in the area, others are veterans from the project. Only one item, these red lines show the classic 95%, 5% thing for statistical significance. There's only one item outside that. And that item was completely different. It was talking really about functional. We moved it to the sociolinguistic scale in the end, because it wasn't really talking about the same thing. And in any case, they both put it at C2. So this showed, this data was really very good, which is in a way surprising with something as complicated as plurilingual pluricultural. Then we had consultation. A whole series of things, a whole bunch of meetings and surveys and stuff, banging up to the main consultation, where we consulted member states, of which there are 47, and I could only get contacts for 35 of them, and of those, 20 replied. And leading cultural institutions like the Goethe Institute, the Alliance Française, the Institut Cervantes, people like that, Cambridge, and various networks and people, 30 plus, and then a whole bunch of individuals who chose to take part, which was 800. And there were then some written submissions from associations. After that, we had piloting, and there were a whole bunch of pilots in different sectors for different things, a total of 66 pilots. And that's it, I think. So that's how it all went. And we feel that the companion model underlines the core messages with that nice little text at the beginning. It provides a richer set of descriptors that can inspire more integrated, collaborative classroom tasks with collaborating to construct meaning, facilitating that collaboration in groups, and then mediating, sort of you've read this text and they got that text, so we'll explain our text to them. And maybe the texts are in German, but we're going to actually produce an artifact in French. And that this encourages the promotion of cross-linguistic mediation of this type and the plurilingual, pluricultural competences that it requires. And what's happening at the moment is that we had a kind of a launch conference in May, and there are currently 35 official case studies happening around Europe and beyond, and we're intending to publish a volume of case studies in 2020, which will show ways in which people have used these descriptors in the classroom to what sorts of activities that they have used them. And a very important and interesting point is that there's a plan to have a search tool on the Council of Europe website, so that you will be able to go to it and say, right, I want to work in French, and I want descriptors for the communicative language activities. Actually make that just spoken interaction. Actually make that just conversation, discussion. We'll have some mediation, like collaborative, construct meaning, all the things to do with group work. Just give me all of the, so you say conversation, discussion, information exchange, collaborating to construct meaning, facilitating collaboration with peers. Give me those descriptors, and it will give you all of those descriptors in a Word file which you can print out. And you could say, I want them for all of them, or I want them just for B1, or I want B1 and B1 plus. So we hope this is a tool which I think people will find very useful, rather than having to try and get them from the original source. So that's it. Thank you. And there's the reference there, the URL.
So thank you very much for this rich talk and for accompanying in this complex process. You have read also the articles, so there will be discussion on that later, and in case necessary, kind of further explanation if necessary. But for the moment, let's open the floor to questions, comments, etc., mainly related to the presentation. Yeah.